biggest threat to global security is the kind of violence and misunderstandings and wars that come out of resource depletion, economic uncertainty, concerns of lack of hope for generations growing up in a world that is getting smaller and seemingly less and less fair.
I have repeatedly said that it's very challenging to translate some of what comes out of the leader of the third party's mouth, Justin Trudeau, as we just showed you in that clip. So, of course, I have a couple of people who are going to be able to interpret that for me. I'm Adrienne Batra. Thanks very much for staying with us here at Sun News. So let's get right to it with our Sun News contributor, Faith Goldie, and Justin Ling joining us from our Ottawa studio. Justin, let me start with you. Can you make sense of what he was trying to say for me?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's anything too complex in his statement. It may not have been the brightest thing he's ever said. But, you know, putting the jingoism aside, I think it's a pretty, reasonable thing to say. Terrorism is essentially grown out of disparity and destruction and political turmoil. That's no great surprise. We know that Al-Qaeda was born in the Pakistani refugee camps. We know that, ISIS was born out of the destruction in Syria. This is not a tremendously controversial thing. I guess what Trudeau should be talking about is how he actually plans to fix it. Whenever he is actually pushed to talk about foreign policy, he kind of just, pivots back to platitudes and kind of meaningless things like, we need to make sure the world is more fair and things along those lines. But he's not wrong. And I mean, this is something that I actually kind of wish Harper would talk more about, because the Canadian foreign policy is actually quite concerned with, building democratic capacity and development as a way to combat extremism. But Harper doesn't quite use those terms.
All right. If I don't get Faith Goldie in to weigh in on this, she's going to jump out of her chair. All right, Faith, take it away.
Okay. When there's a string of bozo eruptions, I think we have to call it a bozo endemic. Justin, you might be able to read those things into Justin's commentary, but I'm not entirely convinced that he is. And let's be very clear, what he said is wrong. When there is ISIS beheading children in Iraq, when there is about to be war had with once G8 nation Russia and Ukraine, when Hamas threatens the very existence of Israel as a nation state and her people, just have to pick one. Just one. Any one. But instead, what do? You talk about how the world's just unfair. Get over it. This guy is not a serious candidate to be a leader of any sort of first world nation, let alone part of the power player nation group that we are, a G7 nation. At a time when our foreign policy is so acutely important to folks at home and folks abroad, this guy is unequipped, and he has proven that time and time again.
And the challenge, of course, Justin, I mean, you're the one that used the term platitudes. It's going to be like looking forward to 2015, for example, when he is on that political stage with Stephen Harper, who many Canadians may not agree with him on certain policies, but feel confident in him as, the head of our government and on the international stage. And standing beside him will be Thomas Mulcair, the leader of the NDP, who also Canadians have some confidence in. Justin's not going to have, really smart people being able to talk in his ear during a debate, a leaders' debate, for example. How does he move past the platitudes with some substance?
I'm not sure he has to. I think the average Canadian likes hearing things like middle power and, honest broker and stuff along those lines. I actually think that he would do quite well, not because I think he has a very fleshed out or thought out foreign policy, but because people like the liberal idea of foreign policy. It might not actually work or really mean much, but it's a nice catchphrase.
Okay, so we are going to elect a prime minister because he gives us the warm and fuzzies. Meanwhile, ISIS, according to Secretary of State John Kerry, poses a threat to North America. But hey, middle power is kind of catchy. That, to me, actually makes me a little bit nauseous. Look, Prime Minister Stephen Harper was asked the very same question. What is the biggest threat to global security? How did he answer? Radical jihad. Ding, 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 ding. Could have picked a lot of different things, but there are some buzzwords. It might not give you the warm and fuzzies, but it's actually correct.
Okay, but what's Stephen Harper actually doing in some of these cases? In some cases, he's not actually, he's contributing some aid to Syria, which I think is something that any kind of prime minister would do. He's nominally started a campaign to try to root out extremists here at home. Fair. But beyond that, on the foreign policy front, I'm not sure you can say Stephen Harper is, the world's greatest crusader against radical Islam. He's kind of pretty far removed. I mean, there was some aid given to Syria,
at
but
least he
not
calls
military
it what it is. We're talking about someone who is willing to say radical Islam, threat to our way of life, versus Justin Trudeau, who after the Boston bombings wanted to go hug some terrorists to find out why they felt like blowing things up. Okay?
I don't think it's insignificant where the Canadian government has done, I think, a relatively decent job in attempting to root out some of the funding mechanisms going from Canada to fund terrorist causes. But Faith just touched on the so-called root causes. Let's go back to that clip. Let's remind everybody about where Justin Trudeau's mentality is when it comes to this terrorism around the world. Let's take a look.
It's only a couple of hours after something has happened that clearly was not an accident in Boston. People have died, many people are injured. You're the Canadian Prime Minister. What do you do?
We have to look at the root causes. Now, we don't know now whether it was terrorism or a single crazy, but there is no question that this happened because there is someone who feels completely excluded, completely at war with innocence, at war with a society. And our approach has to be, okay, where do those tensions come from?
Is that what Canadians want to hear?
As for me, every time I hear Justin Trudeau speak, especially on the topic of foreign policy, at least one of my brain cells spontaneously commits suicide, which is to say I actually feel my IQ drop. Could you imagine Stephen Harper saying, or just a single crazy to describe a Boston bombing? All he had to say in that case was, look, it's hours after the event. We're going to wait for the details to come out. In the meantime, I express my condolences to those people injured and killed. Justin Trudeau, look, Justin Lang, I will agree with you, which is to say, I think that the Canadian populace is actually at risk for voting this guy in just because he's got great hair and kind of effeminate voice, which apparently makes them feel good inside. But to me, who actually views Canada from a realist perspective, which is we are a G7 nation, we are part of that very exclusive club of top tier nations, this guy is not serious, he is not capable. In fact, he is a danger not only to our security, but to our entire future as a country.
Okay, I know that one can't go unchecked. Justin, go ahead.
Okay, so the Boston bombing is a pretty good example, but what did Stephen Harper do after the Boston bombing? His language was definitely more forceful and was more on point. I'll give you that. But functionally, what's the difference? There really wouldn't be. And let's be quite clear. Justin Trudeau, by himself, isn't going to be dictating Canada's foreign policy. There's a lot of Mandarins at deep faith that are still going to be in the job if Justin Trudeau wins. And Marc Garneau would likely be the foreign affairs minister in a hypothetical Liberal government. And Marc Garneau's no slouch. That guy is pretty sharp. And I'm not quite as afraid as Faith of a Justin Trudeau government. I don't think ISIS would be, driving down the streets of Winnipeg if Justin Trudeau wins. I'm not saying that his foreign policy is entirely coherent, clear, or all that smart, but I'm not quite ready to say the sky is falling.
Okay, but here's the thing, Justin. Words matter. I understand that at the end of the day, perhaps we don't have all the resources and capabilities that Stephen Harper would otherwise like to send off to those different hotspots in the world, but words matter. And when the Harper government sought to call female genital mutilation and so-called honor killings barbaric, the other not so wise leader, Justin Trudeau, said, well, we can't really make judgments on the way that people live their lives. Do you want to know what kind of message that sends? Hey, radical Islamists, come on over. So you might not see ISIS marching down the streets of Winnipeg, but all I'm saying is that with Justin Trudeau, the invitation is going to sound a little bit different.
Okay, I'm going to put both of you a little bit on the spot here because this is something that just came out less than an hour ago. It's a piece on thenationalpost.com, and it was written by Ingrid Rivera Konopka. She was the one, and the headline of this piece, Justin, says, I sent Trudeau to that mosque. Yes, that mosque. And she goes on to say in the piece, and I'm quoting her, this is the former EA of Justin Trudeau, knowing what we know now, I don't know that I'd send him back. And then she also goes on to talk about how, you know, the revelations from the United States State Department about it being a terrorist breeding ground in the 90s. She's sort of acknowledging that, you know, she was the one that suggested this to him. She wouldn't do it again, likely. And then also acknowledging that this is the extremist type of Islam, Wahhabism. Your reaction to this new bit of information?
I don't know why they're doing this. Honestly, let the story die at this point. I think Trudeau has made his point clear. You know, he's not concerned about his visit basically contributing to the start of a terrorist organization in Canada. Evidently, you know, there's no evidence that he said anything untowards while he was speaking to them, and there's no real evidence. You know, there's evidence that this mosque was a bad spot 10 years ago. Not a lot of evidence has been a bad spot since. I don't know why they're doing this. Honestly, just let the story die at this point. Maybe you know, in hindsight, it's 2020. Maybe they wouldn't have sent him if it was today. I don't really care. I mean, I know that there's some folks out there who get really whipped up about this, but at the end of the day, I mean, you know, he made maybe there was a bad judgment call. Just leave it at that.
All right, last word to you on this one.
I'll tell you right now that the mainstream media will let it die, unlike we saw with Michael Sona or Nigel Wright, rather, with Wallen or Duffy, where the mainstream media said, how dare Harper throw those staffers and so on and so forth under the bus. Here what we'll see is, oh look, someone else's fault, don't worry, don't blame Trudeau. So yeah, it will die.
Okay, quickly, we have a little bit of time left, but there is one more aspect of this Trudeau deconstructed we want to do. Let's take a look at the clip when he was asked with respect to First Nations accountability.
The Liberal Party is in favor of a disclosure and transparency and accountability. However, what we're not in favor of is partisan attacks on political opponents the way this government has by imposing from the top down measures that aren't given the support to be able to do. There's no point forcing someone to disclose when they don't even have a website upon which to do it.
Okay, time is our enemy, Justin, so I need a quick response from you. So you don't have a website, so you can't disclose? Is that what I'm getting from him?
I don't totally understand Trudeau's opposition to this. I mean, the First Nations Transparency Act maybe came out of a space of, you know, a little bit pettiness. I mean, whether it is or it isn't is kind of irrelevant. There's definitely some misspending going on in First Nations reserves. Evidently, we need it. There's a very, very good case to be made that reserves should be allowed to govern themselves as they please, not under the Indian Act. And in that case, we can talk about how they want to set up their own transparency initiatives rather than having them imposed by the federal government. That is a fair case to make. That's not what Trudeau said. Trudeau wants to repeal it for some reason that I can't determine, and then fill it with something else that he hasn't talked about. So
Justin Trudeau already said that there are good outcomes that have come of this, and hey, guess what? Band members actually support this Transparency Act. It's good for them, and it brings the chiefs down to a place of honesty.
Yes, it sure does. Great discussion. I want to thank Justin Ling, a freelance journalist joining us from our Ottawa studio, and the always brilliant Faith Goldie, our Sun News contributor.